The format war. As gamers, we've come across two particular formats, the cartridge games and the disc games. Both have evolved considerably over the years, but sometimes you wonder which format was more suitable for gaming. With the current state that this format war is in, it appears that the disc format eventually dominated the home consoles, while curiously, cartridges are more dominant in the portable consoles. But has anyone ever looked up in detail the pros and cons to each format? Well, after doing some research, I've made some comparisons between both formats and listed a few particular characteristics in video gaming software. First off, we have durability. It's crazy to think that cartridge games were truly built to last. Looking as far back as the Atari, cartridge games are still surprisingly playable even to this day, just as long as consumers took really good care of it. For the most part, cartridges took a lot of abuse from accidental falls of a considerable height, usually from a table or a shelf, for example, and they still managed to work regardless of the abuse, just as long as the person didn't do something crazy like throw it in a fireplace. However, when it comes to the disc format, they're usually very fragile, and the smallest scratch can cause a disc to be either buggy or just unplayable, resulting in looking up different methods of recovery and preservation of a disc game, which has frustrated many, including myself. This usually leaves you with two options. 1. Buying another copy of the damaged game, or 2. Finding a digital backup online thanks to console emulation, but I'll save emulation for another video. Second, we have manufacturing. Ever since the disc format started to gain momentum in the market, the developers began pointing out that making disc games were relatively cheaper than cartridge games. All developers needed to do was quickly burn the game's data in a disc for a console, rather than programming a cartridge from the ground up. Also, using the disc format, games were made in smaller batches to avoid monetary losses from overproducing games that would not sell very well. Third, we have storage capacity. Another advantage the disc format has over cartridges was the storage capacity of games. While Nintendo 64 cartridges, for example, stored between 4 to 64 megabytes of data depending on the game, the disc-based PlayStation 1 games, for example, could store at least 750 megabytes of data, which meant more content than the developers can include in the games, and at a cheaper price, as previously stated. Some games were so huge it took up at least 3 discs, roughly a little over 2 gigabytes of content. The disc format eventually evolved into the DVD format, having from 4.5 to 8 gigabytes of data storage in dual layer, and now today with the Blu-ray format, which starts from 25 gigabytes to 50 gigabytes in dual layer, then to 100 gigabytes in triple layer, up to a whopping 125 gigabytes of data in quadruple layer. However, cartridge games are still far behind in this aspect, despite dominating the portable console market. The DS game cards, for example, initially held from 8 to 512 megs, depending on the size of the game. The 3DS enhanced it, varying from 128 megs to 8 gigabytes in size. When it comes to cartridge games, there's still plenty of room for improvement. On a side note, with a Nintendo Switch around the corner and reports circling that it's now a cartridge-based home console, expect a lot of technological enhancements of this format in the future. Next, we have loading screens. This is every gamer's pet peeve in video games, having to wait anywhere from a couple of seconds to a few minutes for a level to load. However, some developers find clever ways to distract the player while the game loads, like minigames, and others manage to disguise them in cutscenes, giving the illusion of no loading screens. Most fans would associate this to being in disc formats, but that's not true. Even in cartridges, this rarely occurred for whatever reason. But for the most part, loading times in cartridges are nearly non-existent. Next, and this is a controversial one, piracy. Both sides have their fair share on the matter. While it was relatively easier for hackers to rip a game out of its original disc in order to make digital backups or bootleg copies, cartridges had a slight advantage. Since manufacturers tried many ways to prevent piracy, like the use of lockout chips, pirating cartridges were initially trickier to pull off at first, yet over the years with more modern tools and programs, including console emulation, certain anti-piracy methods were circumvented regardless of what techniques were used for copy protection. Still, software piracy isn't always perfect, and certain games in both formats can come off looking rather buggy at times, even during emulation, due to the complex hardware architecture that some consoles had. And lastly, we have backwards compatibility. Initially, this concept wasn't relatively common at first, but over the years, it has been applied in both physical and in digital formats. While the disc-based consoles easily adapted to the idea, it was slightly trickier yet still possible to pull off in cartridge form. This was usually realized through hardware add-ons, which even expanded on the idea of cross-platform gaming. However, the legal digital approach is usually the best alternative for cartridges, though to be fair, it does work for both formats. Usually, the backwards compatibility feature is included as more of a business tactic in order to appeal to consumers, and not to lose the consumers from the previous console generation. So what do you guys think? Do you prefer the disc format, or do you think cartridges should be the mainstay? Are there any other points I missed? Leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, this has been Hadouken Dude. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Take care.